see if I can not turn it off tonight like I did last week. All right, I think we're good so far. All right, good to see you. Hope you've had a great day. We've had a busy day for myself. You know, my plan was we're having a house painted. And so, well, actually we're having the house where Shay lives, Cindy's mom and dad's house that we remodeled. And so we're finally getting the outside done. And so had a couple of guys come today. They're pressure washing, getting it ready. So I was planning on being there to meet them, get them started, and I was planning on, head on out. And then it dawns on me about 8 o'clock this morning about several things I was supposed to do before they got there. So I get over there and I get busy and I'm trying to get all this stuff going, and I'm cutting back rose bushes and I'm raking back mulch and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, oh, this needs to be done too, and that needs to be done too. And about 5.5 hours later, I finally got to the office. So, and so then I had to get ready for tonight. So it's been kind of a mad dash. All right, so we are in Judges chapter number 12 this evening, and we're going to be continuing with an episode involving Jephthah, who we looked at the last couple of weeks. And then we'll be introduced to 3 other minor judges, as we've made reference to those in the past. And we'll get into that in just a moment. Just by way of our map, real quick, just to kind of let you know sort of where most of the action is going to be happening tonight. We're going to be hearing about a judge from Zebulun. And so thus far, we've not heard of a judge in the first 11 chapters from Zebulun. And just kind of remember that this Gilead area right here is kind of where most of the action's been happening with Jephthah so far. But this western part of Zebulun, this purple area right here, here's Naphtali, there's Asher, Issachar, West Manasseh, there's Zebulun. This western part right here is going to play into our study tonight. And you may learn something that you never realized was in the Bible. So you'll find out a little bit later on, okay? And we'll talk about that. It'll be interesting to see how many are aware of what we're going to cover when we get there. All right, so as we get into Judges chapter number 12, we're going to start out verses 1 through 7. And this is one of the shorter, maybe the shortest chapter in the book of Judges. Verses 1 through 7. So we're going to talk about Jephthah's conflict with the Ephraimites. So remember, the week prior and then last week, we saw the conclusion to the conflict between Jephthah as the judge of Israel, going against the Ammonites and finally defeating the Ammonites. And then, of course, it ended with a really good conversation about Jephthah's vow. There at the end of the chapter, of course, during the battle, he makes this vow, Lord, you give me victory, and whatever first thing comes out of the door of my house, I'll offer it to you as a burnt offering. And when he gets there, it's his only daughter. And she's not a little girl, she's a grown woman, and not yet married. And so we go through that, and the vow is fulfilled, but the scriptures, in some sense, yeah, it's there, but you're kind of left guessing, didn't he sacrifice her? And as we went through that, our conclusion was, I think most of us probably are in agreement that from the evidence, apparently he must have done so. He must have offered his daughter as a human sacrifice and a burnt offering. We talked about some of the factors, and a lot of that obviously is not influenced by the God of the Bible, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not into human sacrifices, other than the sacrifice of his own son was the only one that he ever signed off on. And it had to do a lot with the mixture of pagan worship that had been mixed with Yahweh worship and so forth. And it was a common thing in that day. And already had become, as we know from the first part of chapter number 10, had already become a major influence in the life of Israel. So Jephthah defeats the Ammonites. That's good. The oppression on the Israelites by the Ammonites, that's taken care of now. But that episode's not completely over. It carries over into chapter number 12, in these verses right here involving the Ephraimites. And so there's a conflict that takes place. And the origin of the conflict was not with Jephthah, it's with the Ephraimites. And by the way, there on the map, we were looking at Zebulun. It's the purple section there in the north. Come down towards the middle, you see Ephraim, one of the descendants of Joseph, one of his sons. That's where Ephraim is located. So they're in play as well in what's going on this evening. I failed to point that out just a minute ago. They're angry with Jephthah. And so they come to make their dissatisfaction known. So we pick up beginning in verse number 1. It says, the men of Ephraim gathered together and crossed over toward Zaphon and said to Jephthah, and they would have been over in the Gilead area that I was pointing out just a few moments ago, all right? Why did you cross over to fight against the people of Ammon, and you did not call us to go with you? Now, listen to this. You think that they're not bummed? They said, we will burn your house down on you with fire. They're upset, aren't they? So the tribe of Ephraim is coming, and they're claiming they feel slighted. They've been slighted because Jephthah, according to them, did not invite them to go and participate in the battle against the Ammonites, and they didn't get to be a part of the victory celebration and so forth. Really, quite honestly, it ought not matter. What they should have been rejoicing over the fact was that the Ammonites had been defeated. But they're all upset, and they're feeling slighted. You know, they've been done wrong because they were left out. And so they're angry with Jephthah, even to the point where they're making the threat of burning his house down on top of him, and I would even assume his family that would be in there with him, okay? Now, here's the thing. This is not the first time we've seen something like this from the tribe of Ephraim. And before I get into that any further, as I read this and think about it and have done some studying on this today, I think what the Ephraimites suffered from was a form of narcissism. I really do. I think they had a problem with being narcissists in some way. If you remember in Judges chapter number 8, now just a few weeks ago, when Gideon and his victory over the Midianites, and remember, listen to this. So God, initially when he called Gideon sends out the call for men to come and go to battle. Remember how many showed up? 22,000, right? And then God said, that's too many. You tell anybody that's afraid, anxious, go home. Well, practically all of them went home. and there was a few hundred left or so. And God says, you still got too many, remember? Go down to the Jordan, you're going to drink, and the ones that get on their knees and put their face in the water, they're going to be going home. But the ones that lap like a dog, in other words, they would kneel and they would use their hand to draw it up, kind of like what a dog does with their tongue, how they drink water. Those are the ones you'll keep, 300 guys, okay? So God has decided that in that battle with the Midianites, he's not looking for a huge army, because he doesn't want a huge army getting the glory. The glory is going to go to him. So he uses those 300 men, and with those 300 men, they set the Midianites to flight. And then eventually he did call out to Ephraim, go with us to pursue so that we can finish this battle off and so forth. Well, if you remember, they got all bent out of shape over that, and they come having a beef with Gideon even then. Now, here's the thing. Gideon had a bit more tact and diplomacy about him and how he dealt with it. They're dealing with a different guy when they deal with Jephthah. I mean, think about it. Here's a guy that if he will go through with a vow to sacrifice his own daughter, what do you think he might do to his enemies? So they're messing with a different kind of guy this time. And so the Ephraimites, they just kind of project this mindset as if nobody can do anything without them. If anybody questions them, challenges them, they had to be in the spotlight. They just wanted to be in the glory. They just suffered from a narcissism and pride and arrogance. And here's the thing, all right? Now, here's the thing I want you to think about this. Unfortunately, that's not like some people. If you've been around in church life long enough, you've encountered a few people like that. They are the kinds of people that seek after positions and titles, and they want to become power brokers in the church. And they think that the sun rises and sets on their word and their decision. And y'all know exactly what I'm talking about. And oftentimes, if they don't get their way, they can act like thugs. Bible commentator Herbert Wolf said this. Here's an interesting observation. Listen to this. He said this. Why should the Ephraimites complain about a victory accomplished through God's intervention for the benefit of all the tribes? Like I said a few minutes ago, instead of complaining, they should have just been rejoicing. The victory's been won. Then he says this. It was a strange jealousy that spurred on Ephraim. And it just kind of seemed to be in the water because all of them kind of had this mindset. And as a result, they're so angry with Jephthah, they're threatening to burn down his house on top of him. G. Campbell Morgan said this. He said, this clearly again reveals the sad disintegration of the nation. The consciousness of the unity of the people seems largely to have been lost. And I think that's true. They had been lost. So Jephthah responds, verse number 2. And Jephthah said to them, my people and I were in a great struggle with the people of Ammon. Now listen to this. And when I called you, you did not deliver me out of their hands. Now let me ask you, you tell me in your own words, what did Jephthah just say to them? What did he say when he came back and made his reply?
You didn't have this concern with.
Yeah, but there's something else that's implied in that. What's implied is that there had been a call sent out. So Jephthah's saying, yeah, there was a call sent out, but you didn't come and help. You just sat by while we went in and we had to do all the hard work. They chose to stay on the sidelines. In other words, what he's saying is, your complaint is not genuine. Verse 3. So when I saw that you would not deliver me, I took my life in my hands and crossed over against the people of Ammon, and the Lord delivered them into my hand. Why then have you come up to this day to fight against me?
You know, Brother Steve, that's a lot like Monday morning quarterbacking. Once they found out he's successful, we should have been a part of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they want to be a part of the party, but they don't want to be part of the planning and putting the party together. There again, it's like it reminds me of my football coach, Wilkie Green. I told you all this here back a few weeks ago. His thing, he always tell us, you want to ride the bus, date the cheerleaders, drink the Coke, and get all the glory, but you don't want to pay the price. That sounds like Ephraim, right? Verse 4, now Jephthah gathered together all the men of Gilead and fought against Ephraim. Now look at this. Here we are now. We're in a fight between brothers over a silly, and then you're going to see now it gets even sillier. All right, so now they're fighting. And it says, and the men of Gilead defeated Ephraim because they said, you Gileadites are fugitives of Ephraim, among the Ephraimites and among the Manassites. In other words, they're kind of like saying, we left you guys, we were part of you at one time, and we left, and we kind of doing our own thing now. But my point is this: you see how childish that this thing is becoming? It's just like going down the drain. You know, it's circling the drain in the tub right here. It's just getting worse. The Ephraimites, their silliness, and now this silliness going on. And you see what's going on, and the fact that a victory that God had given Israel, a victory has now like become a postscript that has been completely ignored by both of them. Verse 5, the Gileadites seized the fords of the Jordan before the Ephraimites arrived. And when it talks about the fords of the Jordan, what it's talking about are narrow areas in the Jordan where a person could actually walk across on foot, or they could cross on a donkey. So it's not like a wider, deeper section of it. And so what the Gileadites did, they went and they found the fords there along that area in Jabesh Gilead, and they took control of them. And here's the reason why. And when any Ephraimite who escaped said, "Let me cross over," the men of Gilead would say to him, "Are you an Ephraimite?" And if he said no, then they would say to him, "Then say Shibboleth." And he would say Sibboleth, for he could not pronounce it right. So the Ephraimites had something about either the way they learned to speak, their particular dialect. I don't know exactly why, but they had difficulty pronouncing the H. They couldn't say Shibboleth, it would be Sibboleth. And that way they would know that they were Ephraimites. And so here's the thing. They were they had a very distinct dialect. They knew that there were some things that they could not pronounce and so forth, all right? And so their speech identified them. They were identified by their speech, by their dialect, by their accent, just like we good old Southerners, When we moved, Cindy and I lived in South Georgia for 7.5 years. All right, so we moved from Chattanooga in August of 1982, and we moved to South Georgia, and we lived in Donaldsonville, Georgia, which is in the extreme southwest corner of Georgia. If you go south, you're in Florida. If you go west, you're in Alabama. All right, that's how far southwest it is. And so we lived there for 4 years. I'm in Bible college. I graduate. Then we move up about 70 miles north, up around Albany, I should say. Yeah, all right. If you're from down yonder, it's Albany. All right. And so we're there for 3.5 years. Then we move and we go to Kentucky. So we get up to Kentucky, and you're up there close to Yankee Land, and there's people from all over the world that are at Southern Seminary. All right. And we're living in family housing. And the family housing that we lived in was an old military housing. The townhouses on the end were painted white. It was all brown brick, but the ends were painted white. And the reason why, during World War II, that was supposed to identify this as a civilian housing that it had been turned into at that time. I mean, these buildings were old. I mean, we still had radiator heat. And this is like 1989. And in the summertime, you just raise the window. Try to let some of the heat. So anyway, so we're sitting out there, and there are picnic tables, and we'd hang out with everybody. Well, we're from South Georgia. Well, at that time, we were from South Georgia, originally from Tennessee. We get out there. Well, we both had picked up that South Georgia drawl. My wife had really picked it up. And we would be sitting out there on the picnic tables, and people would come and gather around, and they would say to my wife, "Say something." Just say something. We want to hear you talk. Oh. So here's the thing. There's a really important lesson for us right here to remember, and that is this. Our speech should identify us. Now, I'm not talking about dialect and accent at this point. I'm talking about, as believers, our speech should identify us. Those two young men that were doing the pressure washing on the house today? They're the sons of the man who's painting the adult ed building. Good Christian kids. And just as polite, well-mannered. The way that they spoke, I was really impressed with those kids. Our speech should identify us, just like what I was preaching Sunday morning as we're talking about the nature of the new man in Ephesians chapter number 4. And Paul talks about how that we're to put away lying, speak truth with our neighbor, let no corrupt communications come out of our mouth, and so forth and so on. And I talked about our speech should be truthful speech. It ought to be edifying, positive, good speech. It ought to be gospel speech. People ought to be able to communicate with us, and after having communicated with us for a short period of time, they ought to be able to identify us, because if they've talked to us long enough, Jesus ought to be coming up in the conversation somewhere, wouldn't you think? So just as the speech of the Ephraimites identified them, ours should identify us. And chapter 12, verses 6 through 7 goes on and says this. So they were at the fords, and if an Ephraimite came up and wanted to cross over, and he couldn't pronounce Shibboleth correctly, they knew that he was an Ephraimite. And it says, then they would take him and kill him at the fords of the Jordan. And listen, and there fell at that time 42,000 Ephraimites. Now, if that's the total from the whole battle and conflict, or surely they didn't kill 42,000 at the fords. I mean, the Jordan would have been running with blood. Who knows? But I mean, that's a bunch of people. But now remember something. Remember this conflict they created with Jephthah? He's not the same kind of guy that Gideon was. This guy was ruthless. Verse 7. And Jephthah judged Israel 6 years. Now, that's a relatively short period of time for a judge, okay? One of the shortest times. And then Jephthah the Gileadite died and was buried in the cities of Gilead, which we've pointed out over on the east side of the Jordan. And so then we come to the three minor judges that we have here in chapter number 12. All right, now let's do what we did here back a few weeks ago. Let's do some pronunciation here. All right, so look at verses 8 through 10 there if you got your Bible open. And you'll see in verse number 8 the name Ibzan. How do you think you should pronounce that? Ibzan? Anybody else? That's close. Ibson. Ibson, okay? So it says, after him, Ibson of Bethlehem judged Israel. Bethlehem? What's Bethlehem doing in the picture here? Can y'all tell me where is Bethlehem located? Y'all do know where Bethlehem is located. I hope you know where Bethlehem is located. All right? Yeah, Bethlehem's down here in Judah. All right? But this is not that Bethlehem. Now, this is the part that we were going to talk about. Did you know that there were two Bethlehems? There are two Bethlehems. Now you know. Okay? It's Bethlehem of Zebulun. All right, so Bethlehem of Judah is always referred to as Bethlehem of Judah. Why would they use that Bethlehem of Judah? Well, to distinguish it from the other Bethlehem. Okay? That's the whole reason. So Bethlehem of Zebulun was located in this western section right here. It was about 6 miles northwest of Nazareth, which had been located in this vicinity right here in the northern part of Issachar. Okay? So, Ibson is from Bethlehem of Zebulun. And we actually have come across this before. In Judges chapter number 19, in the allotment of Zebulun's land, Bethlehem is mentioned in that text. Okay? It just gets overlooked. Goes on and says, he had 30 sons, and he gave away 30 daughters in marriage. So he had 60 children. 30 sons, 30 daughters. And what else goes along with that? We've talked about this before. Multiple wives, polygamy, okay? And or maybe concubines. Who knows? We're not told about his wives. He had 30 sons, and he gave away 30 daughters, and he brought in 30 daughters from elsewhere for his sons. Why? What does that tell us about this man? He's wealthy. He's a businessman. This guy is making contracts and covenants and alliances by marrying off his daughters to the sons of kings and so forth and so on, or wealthy landowners and what have you. And at the same token, he's marrying his sons off to their daughters as well. This guy was working it. And he was a very wealthy man. And he goes on and says, and he judged Israel for 7 years. Then Ibzan died and was buried at Bethlehem of Zebulun. Okay? So now every time you hear Bethlehem of Judah, you know why specifically it is making that particular reference. Okay? Now, we come to the next minor judge in verses 11 through 12. And if you'll look in verse number 11, you'll see that name. So give it a shot. How do you pronounce that one? Not Musk. The man at X, formerly Twitter. That's the way it always says. X, formerly Twitter, right? All right. So Elon, everybody in agreement with that? Alone. He was alone. All right. After Elon, the Zebulunite, judged Israel, he judged Israel 10 years, and Elon, the Zebulunite, died and was buried at Ajalon in the country of Zebulun. So we don't know a whole lot about him at all. Now, that really doesn't mean that he didn't accomplish something worthwhile just for whatever reason. The Holy Spirit chose not to put it in Samuel's heart to write about it. But that's all we know. Last one, verses 13 through 15. All right, in verse 13, give that one a shot. Yeah, Abdon. Just like our Dons, except it's Ab, all right? This Don had abs. That's what it was. Abdon.
So what's his dad's name?
Hillel.
Okay.
Yeah. Abdon, the son of Hillel, the Pirathonite, judged Israel. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode on 70 young donkeys. What's the significance of that? He's wealthy. Yeah, he was wealthy. I mean, if you have that many kids and you can afford 70 young donkeys for your sons to ride and your grandsons, you're well off. Okay? Verse 15. He judged Israel for 8 years. So you see, we're in a group of judges here that have relatively, comparatively speaking to other judges, short tenures. All right? Verse 15. Then Abdon, the son of Hillel, the Pirathonite, died and was buried in Pirathon in the land of Ephraim. So down here just above Judah, that lower purple area, in the mountains of the Amalekites. And those, it talks about in the mountains of the Amalekites, that goes back to a time of Israel's wilderness wanderings, the people's group that God brought a curse upon because of their opposition and troubling Egypt during their wilderness wanderings. That's why that's mentioned there. All right, so that brings us to the end of chapter number 12. All right, so, all right, any questions?
Did you say they were called
Minor judges. And the reason is because not that they are less important, it's just that there's less told. And it's just like what I've made the reference to, the major and the minor prophets in the Old Testament. The reason why that terminology is used is the major prophets, their writing was far much more extensive. The minor prophets were less extensive. Doesn't mean that their message was not as important. It's just the volume of materials. That's the difference. Okay?
So, do we draw from this also that this last guy, last judge here, was he an Ephraimite? buried,
Apparently so. The implication is that terminology is not used, but the implication is that he is, because that's where he's buried.
so we've gone from being the enemy, in-house fighting cousins, 17 years later, after the reign of the last two, and now the judge has come from that group that's been so opposed to him.
Yeah, and and God raises up judges, and from most of the tribes, by the time you get through the book of Judges, there are judges that have been raised up from the majority of the tribes. And a lot of times what you have to keep in mind, and I mentioned this earlier when we started in the book of Judges, some of the judges, their influence covers a larger portion of the nation. And some of the judges, they judged Israel in a smaller locale. It wasn't as extensive of an impact, okay? It depends on the particular oppressor and how far-reaching that was at their time, okay? All right, any other questions? All right, very good. All right, I will conclude, and thank you all online that have joined us. Have a great night. God bless. And I'm going to turn it over to Brother Don Harris. He's going to lead.